Hello, everyone. Before I begin my story, I'd like to say just a few words, if you'll allow me. It feels a bit like I'm knocking gently on the door to my own memories, and I want to share what I find with anyone out there who has ever felt a deep sense of loneliness, even while living under the same roof as their family. My name is Michael Anderson, and I'm 72 years old this year. Though I must admit, there are moments when I still catch myself thinking I'm a young man. When people hear about life at my age, they probably imagine I should be taking it easy by now, resting and enjoying a peaceful retirement, spending happy days with my children and grandchildren. But peace doesn't just arrive automatically when you stop working. There is a kind of sadness that has no voice. And there are wounds, the deepest kinds, that come from the very people you hold closest in the world. I have lived nearly my entire life for my family. I gave them everything I had, without reservation. I never once pinched pennies when it came to their needs or wants, because I always believed that any money spent to support our home, no matter how little, was money well spent. I never kept a running tally of how much I spent on my son, or a list of all the things I gave him. But through all these years, there is one thing I have always wished for, one hope I've held on to. It's the desire that even as my physical strength fades, I will continue to be a person of substance, a man who matters. The most painful discovery I've made in my old age wasn't about my savings running out or my health declining. The saddest thing was losing my role. No one asks for my thoughts anymore. No one feels the need to listen to my opinion. And somewhere along the way, without me even noticing when it happened, I became someone who was, well, it was fine if I was there, but it wasn't a problem if I wasn't. I had become someone they could simply take or leave. I imagine there are a lot of fathers and grandfathers out there who have felt the exact same way. So today, I'm going to share a part of my life with you. It isn't a tragedy, not really, but it's a story that might make you think. It might make you look around your own home and ask if there's someone there who is slowly, quietly becoming invisible. Please, listen to my story. Every small detail is a turning point. It's the story of how a father that no one paid any mind to became the one person who could make his entire family stop and finally change. After I took an early retirement from the construction firm where I'd worked for over 40 years, I imagined my mornings would be spent sipping coffee on the back porch or taking slow, leisurely walks under the falling autumn leaves. I was wrong. Instead of rest, I entered a new phase of my life, a full-time job that was unpaid and, I soon learned, unappreciated. My mornings were spent working a part-time job as an attendant at a nearby parking garage. It wasn't strenuous work, but it was enough to make me feel like I still had some value, that I was still contributing. My afternoons were what my son called family time, but in reality, they were dedicated to taking care of my beloved 4-year-old grandson, Leo. Picking him up from daycare, making his dinner, giving him his bath, putting him to bed, playing with him. Almost every aspect of his care fell to me, and me alone. At first, I didn't complain at all. He's my grandson, my own flesh and blood, and I considered it a blessing to be the one to look after him. I truly believed it was a natural and honorable thing for a man my age to be, close to his grandchild, to be a source of strength for his family. But slowly, a quiet disappointment began to creep in. No one ever asked, "Are you tired, Dad?" No one ever said, "How was your morning at work?" No one ever offered, "Dad, I can see you've had a long day. Let me take over with Leo tonight." I felt like a shadow, a silent functionary who just did what was expected, whose own voice was never heard. One evening, I brought something up. "You know," I said, "the floor in the bathroom gets really slick. I think we should install a grab bar in the tub, just in case Leo slips and falls." Before I could even finish my thought, my son, Jason, cut me off. Yeah, I'll look into it, Dad." But that was the end of it. Nothing ever happened. I eventually went out and bought a sturdy steel grab bar myself and left it in a corner of the utility room. A month passed, and it was still sitting there, untouched. a fine layer of dust settling on the box. Lately, my daughter-in-law Susan had become quick to anger with Leo. She would snap at him over the smallest things, her voice sharp and loud. Leo is a sensitive boy, and he would often flinch and start to cry whenever he heard his mother's raised voice. On one such occasion, I spoke to her gently. "Honey," I said softly, "maybe if you lowered your voice just a little, he gets so scared." Susan looked at me and didn't say a word. She just gave me this one look, a quick, sharp glance that cut me right to the bone. It was cold, it was distant, it was full of contempt. And what about my son, Jason? I tried to talk to him once about their spending. I'd noticed a steady stream of non-essential purchases, new gadgets and things they didn't really need. I just said, you two should try to put a little more into savings. You'll need it for Leo's future." He closed his laptop, leaned back in his chair, and said in a voice as cold as ice, "Just stay out of our business from now on, Dad." Those words felt like a knife. Stay out of our business? Was I not part of this family anymore? I've lived in this very house for nearly 40 years. This is the house that my wife and I built, the one we poured our life savings into. And now? Was I just a freeloader? Someone just staying in my son's house? It got worse. Sometimes, when I was sitting with Leo, teaching him his letters, or telling him an old story from when I was a boy, Susan would walk by, shake her head, and whisper something to Jason. I could never quite hear the words, but the look in her eyes was unmistakable. It was annoyance. There were days I would sit and think to myself, would it be better for them if I just wasn't here? I started noticing all the little things. I would cook the dinner, I would serve it, and after the meal, I would be the one to clear the table and do the dishes. Everyone else would just get up and leave, but I would be the last one standing there, wiping down the table, gathering the trash. No one ever said, "Dad, you sit down." "I'll get that." No one ever asked, "Are you tired today?" I started to wonder if maybe I was just being too sensitive. I didn't want to be a burden, so I forced a smile and carried on. I kept playing with Leo, kept comforting him when he cried. I kept myself busy from morning until night, but the feeling of being invisible, of being a ghost in my own home, grew stronger with each passing day. I am not a useless man. I still work. I'm in good health. My memory is still sharp. And yet, I am not seen as someone whose opinion counts for anything. One day, I sat quietly and just thought back on my life. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning, make a pot of coffee, sweep the front porch, rinse out the dishcloth from the night before. I'd head out to work at 7:30 in the morning and spend the next 4 hours on my feet in that parking garage. At noon, I would return home, fix a small lunch for myself, and eat alone before heading out again to pick up my grandson Leo from his daycare. The afternoons were for him, and my evenings were for the house, clearing the dinner table, washing the dishes, mopping the kitchen floor. By 10 o'clock at night, I would turn off the light in my bedroom. I'd sit there in the dark for 15 minutes or so, just letting the quiet settle over me before I could finally lie down and try to sleep. That was my day. A day full of tasks, but empty of any feeling. Once, I tried writing a single sentence on the calendar I keep in my room. Dad was tired today. No one ever saw it. Another time, while I was standing at the sink washing the dishes, I tried coughing, just a little, hoping someone might turn around from the living room and ask, "Dad, are you all right?" But no one did. So, I started to make myself a ghost truly. I wanted to see if, one day, someone would notice that a person was missing from this house. Those were the first days of my silence. A silence of words, a silence of feelings, a silence of my own existence. I don't ask for praise. I don't want to be remembered as some great, heroic father. All I have ever wanted is a single look that was willing to listen. A simple question, "Dad, what do you think?" But that wish, in this house I worked my whole life to build and protect, that simple wish had become the greatest luxury imaginable. I started to shrink into myself. It wasn't out of anger or a desire to place blame. It was simpler than that. I was just tired. Tired of speaking and never being heard. Tired of offering my opinion only to be told, "Just stay out of our business." tired of feeling like my very presence brought no one joy, and my absence would go unnoticed. And so, I fell silent. That evening at dinner, I didn't ask my usual question. So, was Leo a good boy at daycare today? I just quietly put some green beans on my grandson's plate, poured a little more soup into my son's bowl, and then ate my own meal with my head down. I didn't speak, I didn't look up, I didn't try to join their conversation. I thought for sure someone would ask, "Dad, what's wrong?" But it never happened. My son, Jason, just kept scrolling through his phone. My daughter-in-law, Susan, glanced at her watch again and again, probably thinking about some project at the office. My grandson, Leo, ate his food quietly. He looked over at me a few times, but he didn't say a word. I almost had to laugh to myself. Even when I don't say a word, no one thinks anything is wrong. The next day, I continued my silence. I didn't ask about their day. I didn't say a word when Leo scattered his toys all over the living room floor. I didn't correct Jason when he got a fact wrong while talking about something he'd seen on the news. I just gave a little nod, offered a faint smile, and after dinner, I went out to the back porch and sat by myself next to the old chrysanthemum bush, which was starting to lose its leaves to the autumn air. This went on for a week. Then, I stopped picking Leo up from daycare. I went to my job in the morning, just like always, but instead of going from there to the daycare center, I just kept on driving. I didn't tell anyone. I never made a formal declaration saying, "I'm not picking up your son anymore." I just stepped back. Like a guest who wasn't invited, I quietly turned and walked away. In the afternoons, when my shift at the garage was over, I didn't go straight home. I would walk slowly through the neighborhood park, find an empty bench, and just sit, listening to the sparrows chattering in the trees. I wouldn't get home until after 8 o'clock. When I did, I'd go straight to my room, close the door, and I wouldn't come out into the living room at all. No one ever called me for dinner. No one ever said anything. I'd turn on the little lamp by my bed and switch on my small radio, just for the sake of having some sound. I could hear the footsteps in the hallway outside my door. I could hear the low murmur of conversation from the living room fade as the night wore on. The sound of the television, the clatter of plates, the rush of water in the kitchen sink, all of it. It was as if I wasn't even there. Only once during that entire week did my son knock on my door. "Dad, you okay in there?" Leaning my back against the wall, I stared up at the ceiling and answered in the quietest voice I could manage. "I'm fine, just resting a bit." When he heard that, he didn't ask anything else. The door clicked shut, leaving behind a long silence that felt as deep and dark as the night outside. I was shocked, not by his question, but by the complete and utter lack of real concern. I had assumed that if an old man in the house suddenly changed his entire routine, stopped showing his face, stopped speaking, someone would feel a sense of alarm. But I was wrong. Everyone just kept spinning in their own orbits. Susan went to work, came home, and disappeared into her phone. Jason watched the news, ate his dinner, and then shut himself in his home office. Only Leo, perhaps the only soul in that house who still truly remembered me, was not yet old enough to put his thoughts into words. I was completely and utterly alone in my own home. Every night, I could hear the sound of my family's laughter drifting from the living room. Every morning, I could hear their footsteps passing by my bedroom door, like no one ever stopped. I thought about my wife, Margaret. She's been gone 10 years now. Back when she was alive, whenever I was feeling down, she would put her hand on my arm and say, "What's wrong, Michael? Tell me." And just like that, I could pour it all out. Now, there was no one left to say those words. I started keeping a journal, just a few short lines each day, day 5. No one has asked. Leo cried today. There was no one to comfort him. I watched from behind the curtain. I think I am truly starting to disappear. I wasn't disappearing in body. I was disappearing from their awareness. My very existence, it seemed to have no value beyond being there to help. One day, I came home from my job to find the gate to our house locked from the inside. I stood there for a full 10 minutes, waiting. No one had even realized I wasn't home yet. Finally, I pulled out my phone and called my son, Jason. When he answered, his voice was full of surprise. "Oh, Dad, you weren't home yet? We all thought you were in your room resting, that you hadn't gone out." I was silent for a few seconds before I whispered into the phone, "Yes. You could say that your father is resting." He rushed to the gate then, fumbling with the latch to let me in. He offered a clumsy, awkward smile. "Sorry about that. You can come in." I walked into my own home like an unfamiliar guest. Someone once said that when an old person in the house suddenly falls silent, you shouldn't assume it's because they have nothing left to say. You should be afraid when you realize they have made the conscious decision to stop speaking. I don't think of myself as a difficult man. I have no desire to cast a heavy shadow over my family's life, but I could no longer stand being a silent, dutiful ghost, a presence whose voice no one bothered to hear. My silence wasn't a surrender. My silence was the most sophisticated form of rebellion I could imagine. It was a kind of rejection that used no words, a protest designed to be felt rather than heard. I didn't expect them to understand right away. I would simply wait. I would wait patiently until they finally noticed that someone was missing. And when they did, I would ask them, "Can you hear your father's voice now?" By the 10th day, I had kept my silence long enough that the sounds of the house had taken on a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. I no longer clearly heard my grandson's laughter in the morning. I didn't hear the familiar sound of my son grinding beans for his morning coffee. The house had become unnervingly quiet. And then, the chaos began. That morning, just as I was arriving at the front gate, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a polite but hesitant voice on the other end identified herself as my grandson Leo's teacher from daycare. Her voice was clear. "Mr. Anderson, Leo didn't come in today with his backup bag or a hand towel. He also doesn't have his sippy cup or a change of clothes like he usually does." I closed my eyes and stood there for a moment before I replied, "Thank you for letting me know. I'll pass that along to the family." After hanging up, I just stood there on the porch, motionless. Not 2 minutes later, I heard the squeal of tires as my daughter-in-law, Susan's, car screeched to a halt in the driveway. The front door was thrown open with a bang. I heard the frantic slap of her sandals on the hardwood floor. And then, her sharp, scolding voice. "What the hell? Didn't anybody get the kid's bag ready? Didn't you see it wasn't done? Your father always does it. I'm trying to get to work. And now I'm getting calls from his teacher. This is so frustrating." My son, Jason, was sitting at the kitchen table, likely just having returned from a run to the convenience store. He looked around, completely bewildered, and let out a heavy sigh. "Dad, I don't think he's been taking Leo to daycare for the last few days." Susan cut him off immediately. "And you didn't ask him about it? You're his son. What am I supposed to do? Read his mind?" I sat in my room, my hands resting on my knees, my eyes fixed on the thin curtains as they swayed gently in the breeze. I kept my mouth shut. I offered no explanation. I made no defense. That evening, my grandson, Leo, came down with a fever. It wasn't high, but he was lethargic. His face was flushed, and he kept complaining that his head hurt. Susan scrambled frantically to find the thermometer, while Jason ran out to the pharmacy for some children's Tylenol. They asked each other anxious questions. "Do you think it's because he didn't have his things at daycare? Maybe he got cold during his nap?" And I still didn't leave my room. Leo's crying was a high-pitched wail that seemed to tear through the very walls of the house. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling a storm raging inside me. I loved that little boy with every ounce of my grandfatherly heart. But I had chosen silence. Just then, the door to my room opened. My son stood there, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice thick with anger. "Dad, you see the state Leo is in and you don't have anything to say? Why won't you help us? Didn't you call anyone?" I slowly set down the calendar I'd been holding in my hands and looked him straight in the eye. There wasn't a trace of anger in my gaze, only a sadness too deep for words. I answered him. "Because no one in this house needs my opinion. The room fell deathly quiet. Jason just stood there, his lips pressed into a thin, tight line, his eyes wavering. I continued, "You told me to stay out of your business. Susan doesn't want my opinion on how to raise Leo. Any suggestion I make is ignored. So, I decided I shouldn't get in the way anymore." He bit his lip, his voice rising. "But Dad, why would you say something so strange? Everything falls apart when you're not here." I let out a soft chuckle. It wasn't a laugh of satisfaction, nor was it one of mockery. It was simply the laugh of a man who had come to understand that silence has its own sound. I didn't answer him. I didn't add another word. I stood up, left my room, and walked to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. As I passed by Leo's room, I saw Susan dabbing his forehead with a cool cloth, her hands trembling with worry. I turned away. My heart had softened, but my resolve had not. Because now was the time for my family to finally feel the value of a person's presence. 3 days later, a small family meeting was convened. It began with a question that seemed simple on the surface, but it carried the slow, seismic weight of an earthquake. "Dad, how much longer are you going to be silent?" It was Susan who spoke. The words came out during dinner. She had put down her fork and was looking directly at me, not with accusation, not with anger, but with a visible exhaustion that seemed to have settled deep in her bones. "Leo misses his grandpa so much. He refuses to eat if you don't come out to the living room. Ever since you stopped taking him to and from daycare, everything has been a mess." My son, Jason, who had been quiet for a long time, finally added his own voice. "Dad, I'm sorry if I've been insensitive, but you're honestly the only thing this house is missing." I lifted my head. I looked from his face to hers, and then my gaze settled on the spot where Leo was sitting. My grandson's head was bowed, his small hands gripping the edge of his chair, a sad and lonely expression on his little face. I took a deep breath and spoke gently. "I am only doing what you all wanted. You all wanted my silence. And now, I am silent. You all said you didn't need my advice, so I haven't said a word. You all said you didn't want me to interfere, so I stepped back. But, now that you can feel my absence, you finally understand. Is it too late for us?" That was the thought that crossed my mind that evening. After dinner, for the first time I could remember, my daughter-in-law, Susan, sat down at the table and simply waited for everyone else to finish eating. She didn't have her cell phone out. She didn't get up and start clearing the plates like she always did. She just sat there, looking at me. She placed both of her hands flat on the table and asked, her voice soft and even, "Dad, how much longer are you going to be silent?" Her voice wasn't high-pitched, or forceful, or angry. It was just a very human question. A very real one. I was stunned. Not because she had asked the question itself, but because it was the first time in such a very long time that anyone had actually tried to hear what was truly in my heart. My son, Jason, sat down right beside her. My grandson, Leo, after finishing his meal, didn't run off into the living room to play like he usually would. Instead, he was biting his lip, staring down sadly at the little throw pillow he was hugging tightly in his arms. I looked from one face to the next, 3 faces I knew as well as my own, and yet, for so long, it felt as if they had all been covered in a thick layer of dust. Now, one by one, they were lifting their heads and looking me straight in the eye. Not as the old man in the house, but as a person, as a human being. I let out a slow, quiet breath. It wasn't a sigh of triumph or a sound meant to draw attention to myself. It was simply the feeling of finally being allowed to breathe with the true voice of my own soul. I spoke slowly. I never intended to stay silent forever. I thought I was doing exactly what all of you wanted me to do. Susan hesitated for a moment before she answered. We never meant for it to be like that, Dad." I looked at her, and my gaze wasn't cold or accusing. It was just calm, with a stillness so profound it felt like it could bring a person to tears. Maybe you never said it out loud with your words. But the quick glances away when I started to speak, the way you'd cut me off, the complete indifference you showed to any advice I offered, all of those Things were a very clear answer. Crew, my son looked down at the table. He clenched his hands into loose fists. I looked him right in the eye, and without raising my voice in the slightest, I spoke each word as if I were hammering a nail into the old wooden table between us. You told me, Dad, just stay out of our business from now on. Do you remember saying that? He lifted his head, and his eyes were red. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I turned my attention to my grandson. His big, worried eyes were still fixed on me, his lips pressed together in a tight line. I offered him a small smile and softened my voice. You love your grandpa very much, don't you, Leo? But you haven't been able to play with me for the last few days, and that's made you lonely, hasn't it? Leo nodded quickly, and then he suddenly scrambled down from his chair, ran over, and threw his arms around my legs, hugging them tight. His little voice was trembling. Grandpa, I'll be a good boy, please, please don't be quiet anymore. I bent my knees until I was down on his level and wrapped my arms around him. My own back began to tremble, not from exhaustion, but from the overwhelming feeling of finally being seen. I was being acknowledged not for a role I played or a responsibility I fulfilled, but simply for the love I had to give. That night, we all sat there together for a long, long time. We didn't talk about what schools Leo should attend someday. We didn't talk about money. We didn't talk about who was right and who was wrong. We just exchanged our first truly honest words in years. I'm so sorry, Dad, Susan said quietly. I just forgot to pay attention to how quiet you'd become. I can't imagine what it feels like to be in your shoes, but I know I would feel so hurt if I thought nobody needed me anymore. Then, I heard Leo's small voice pipe up. Grandpa, I want to draw a picture with you tomorrow. I listened to it all in silence. Every single word felt like a gentle stream of water, washing away all the dust that had settled over my heart for so long. I said, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, the truth is, I'm not angry at any of you. I'm just sad. I was sad because I felt like I wasn't a part of this family's conversation anymore. I looked out the window. The sky that night was clear and brilliant with stars. I don't want any of you to feel like you have to obey my every word. All I want is for someone to just pause for a moment and listen when I have something to say. That night, I lay down in my old bed, and for the first time in months, I slept soundly all the way through until morning. There were no bad dreams, no nightmares, no worries turning over and over in my mind. There was just a lightness in my heart. The next morning, I was in the kitchen making a pot of coffee when Susan came downstairs, holding a few reusable grocery bags. She kept her head down and said in a small voice, Dad, is there anything special you'd like to eat today? I looked up at her and smiled. Just buy whatever Leo likes. I'll eat anything, as long as we all eat it together, as a family. She nodded, and I was sure her eyes were a little red. Before she walked out the front door, she stopped and turned back to me. Dad, if you have some time today, would you teach me how to make that fish stew your mother used to make? I stood there in silence for a long moment. It was as if I had heard those very words from my late wife, a gentle echo from a time I thought was lost forever. I answered with a soft smile. Of course, that recipe, it takes patience and a little bit of kindness. That day, the whole family ate lunch together. My grandson, Leo, brought me a picture he had just finished drawing. Grandpa, this is you. There's a chair by the window and you have a smile. I laughed. Yes, that's Grandpa, all right. The meal was filled with the sound of laughter. No one spoke of the days of my silence. No one cast blame or tried to decide who had been right and who had been wrong. We were simply looking at one another, understanding each other little by little, closing the distance between us with our eyes. And I felt like I was a part of the family again. I used to think to myself, if I were suddenly gone, would this house even notice that a piece of itself was missing? The person who got up early to make the coffee, the person who set out the food on the trays before calling everyone to the table, the person who waited for his grandson to come home, who wiped his hands clean before welcoming him inside, the person who made sure the buttons on his grandson's coat weren't crooked. I never intended to ask them that question out loud. It was just the quiet curiosity of a father who had spent half a century standing in the background, behind everyone else. After the serious conversation we'd had the day before, I could feel the air in the house had grown a little warmer. My daughter-in-law, Susan, went out of her way to be thoughtful. My son, Jason, would sometimes call me over to watch a show on television with him. And Leo? Well, it goes without saying. Every evening, he would cling to my arm, refusing to let go. I cherished these moments. But the more I cherished them, the more a familiar anxiety began to creep back in. Was this change genuine? Was it real, born from a true shift in their hearts? Or was it just a passing phase, a temporary current that would soon fade, leaving me once again in that familiar, empty space? The feeling of being someone whose presence or absence didn't really matter either way. I did not want to fade away quietly from this world. I needed to know for myself if I truly had a place here. And so, I decided to leave the house for one night. It was a Friday evening, after dinner. I was sitting with Leo, working on a jigsaw puzzle, just like we always did. He started to get sleepy and let out a big yawn, so I picked him up, carried him to his bedroom, tucked him in, and placed a soft kiss on his forehead. "Grandpa loves you," I whispered. It was a habit, something I did every night. He smiled in his sleep. I stood there for a long time, just watching him. No one knew it was a quiet goodbye. I went back to my room and carefully slid open my dresser drawer, making sure it didn't make a sound. My belongings were few. A small duffel bag with a couple changes of clothes, my wallet, and a small notebook tucked into the hidden pocket of my old jacket. I didn't take my cell phone. I didn't want to leave any clues. I didn't want to make it easy for them to call and say, "Dad, come home," and avoid having to explain myself. Before I left, I placed a piece of paper, folded in half, next to the coffee pot on the kitchen counter. "I'm heading out for a little while. Don't worry, if you start to miss me, just think about the last few days." I left the house at 9 o'clock. The city was bathed in a soft, gentle light. I walked slowly down the small side streets, and the sound of my shoes on the pavement seemed as loud and clear as my own heartbeat. I didn't take a taxi. I walked all the way to the nearest station and caught the last train out to a small coastal town. It was an old place, a town where my wife, Margaret, and I used to take Jason for a week every summer when he was a boy. There was a wide, sandy beach, a rocky shoreline, little shacks selling grilled fish, and an old wooden pier where we used to sit, drinking tea and watching the waves roll in. I hadn't come for nostalgia. I had come to find something inside myself that still hadn't faded away. The room I rented was a small, detached space behind an old family home. It had a single bed, an old ceiling fan that turned slowly, and the sound of the waves whispering just outside the rusty screen door. I lay down on the bed and stretched out my hand, as if trying to grasp the empty space beside me. I thought of Margaret. "Margaret," I whispered, as if she were lying right there next to me. "If I wasn't in that house anymore, do you think they would remember me?" There was no answer. Only the sound of the waves. The next morning, I went out to the ocean early. I sat on that same old wooden pier, and the cold sea breeze felt sharp against my cheeks. It seemed to lighten the weight in my heart, just a little. I looked down at my own fingers. The calluses from chopping vegetables, from holding my grandson, from wringing out the laundry. I looked at my worn-out shoes. The very same ones I always wore when I walked Leo to daycare. I thought to myself, no one notices the little things. But without them, a family falls into chaos. In that moment, I decided it was time to go home. I stopped at a small diner by the road and ordered a hot cup of tea. The owner came out from behind the counter, holding a telephone receiver. "Excuse me, sir," he asked. "Are you a Mr. Anderson? There's a phone call for you." I was a little surprised. My son. He had been calling every single place he could think of that I had ever been. I borrowed the innkeeper's phone and opened my messages. 27 missed calls. My inbox was completely full of texts. "Dad, where are you? Please, I just need to hear your voice, even for a second." I was up all night. Leo was clutching your pillow, crying. Grandpa, please come home soon. Dad, I was wrong. I was so wrong. If you're angry, you can yell at me, you can hit me, whatever you want. Just, please stop being silent like this. I always just thought you were a quiet person. But now I realize, I had just gotten so used to forgetting you were even there, that I stopped seeing you at all. I sat right there on the small wooden stool, a slow warmth spreading behind my eyes. The ocean breeze was still cold, but my heart, bit by bit, was starting to feel warm again. That night, I went home. The little house that had once felt so empty, a place where I was sure I had become an invisible man, now, every single window was lit up, casting a warm glow into the dark street. I stood at the front gate, and before I could even find my keys, before my hand could even touch the lock, the front door flew open. The first one to rush out was my grandson, Leo, his face streaked with tears as he shouted, "Grandpa!" He ran to me and threw his arms around my waist, hugging me with all his might. His whole small body was trembling. It was a hug that felt so familiar, and yet so desperate, as if he was afraid that if he let go, I might just disappear into the darkness again. My son, Jason, stood in the doorway, his eyes red and swollen. He lowered his head, his voice thick with emotion. "Dad, I'm sorry. From the bottom of my heart, I am so sorry." My daughter-in-law Susan stood beside him silent, her head also bowed. But in her eyes, I could see a flood of regret and guilt that needed no words. I walked into the house, saying nothing. I just held my grandson close and gently patted his back. "Grandpa's home now," I whispered into his hair. "Not going anywhere." That evening, our family sat together for a long, long time. No one blamed me. No one asked, "Why did you do that?" We were just together. Simply being in the same room, breathing the same air, was enough. I took a sip of the warm tea Susan had brewed for me. It was a little weak, but it was warm. It felt just like the embrace of my family right now. I looked up and saw Leo, who was now leaning his head against my shoulder, his breathing soft and even. I spoke softly, my voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes," I said, "it's not that we aren't cherished. It's just that no one notices we're here. Not until we're really and truly gone." A week after I returned, the atmosphere in our house felt truly different. It wasn't a temporary change born from guilt. It was something small but solid, a quiet shift that made me feel like I was slowly being placed back into my rightful spot in the family. In the mornings, Jason no longer rushed out the door without a word. Instead, before he left for work, he would lean his head into my room and say, "Dad, it's going to be windy today. Don't forget your coat." Susan, who used to prepare meals in the kitchen without even seeming to notice I was there, now offered me a smile before dinner, handing me my plate first. "Here you go, Dad," she said one evening. I cooked the fish tonight, using Mom's old recipe. I felt a jolt in my chest. Mom's recipe. She was talking about my late wife, Margaret's, cooking. Margaret had never learned any fancy techniques, but she had a unique way of seasoning her dishes. A little bit of soy sauce, a little bit of ginger. Simple things, really. She never said much about it, but it was always the taste of home. That day, as I sat at the table, the familiar aroma of that fish stew seemed to catch in my throat. It wasn't because it was particularly delicious, or even because of the nostalgia. It was the overwhelming feeling, for the first time in so many years, that someone had cooked a meal specifically to make sure I wasn't forgotten. That Sunday, Jason approached me. "Dad, let's all go out for dinner this weekend." You picked the place. My treat. I was a little taken aback. Going out to eat, for many people, it's a perfectly normal thing. But for me, I had spent most of my life getting used to saying, "Oh, anything's fine," or "I'll eat after you," or "Just give Leo his food first." Now, here he was asking me, "Dad, what do you want to eat?" I gave him a gentle smile. "A meal out sounds nice, but nothing fancy. Any place with good grilled fish from the ocean would be fine by me." "Ah," Jason smiled back. "You got it, Dad. I'll find the best seafood place around." On Sunday evening, we went to a small restaurant down by the riverfront. The space was cozy, but it was clean and had a warm, welcoming feeling. We had just sat down when the server brought over the menus. Before I even had a chance to look, Susan looked up from her seat across the table. "Dad, what would you like to eat? Let's order for you first." I replied out of old habit. "Oh, whatever you all are having is fine. I'm happy as long as you enjoy your meal." But this time, she shook her head. "No. Tonight is for you to eat what you like. You've worked so hard for this family for so long." I was stunned. It was such a simple sentence, but it felt like it gently reached in and touched a loneliness I had kept, locked inside myself for 72 years. Throughout the meal, Jason actively served me, placing a piece of grilled fish on my plate, refilling my water glass, and he never forgot to ask, "Dad, is it too spicy? Do you have any allergies? I can tell the kitchen if you do." He even said, "Next time, tell me what your favorite dish is. I'll make a reservation in advance." I just ate and smiled. I didn't say much. It wasn't that I couldn't speak, but it was because, for the first time, I felt like I was being listened to, not as a functionary, but as a person who deserved to be loved. Beside me, Susan wiped a bit of food from Leo's mouth, and then she reached over and put a serving of vegetables onto my plate. "Dad, I remember Mom once mentioned that you can't eat shrimp. Is that true? That's why I told them to order the fish special instead of the seafood platter." I was a little surprised. She remembered that? It was just a small, offhand comment I'd made years ago. When we'd all gone to a company party together, I had said quietly at the time, "I'm a little allergic to shrimp. I get a rash if I eat it." No one had said anything in response. I figured no one had even been paying attention. And yet, today, she remembered. I set down my fork and looked around the table at my family. The three of them. A single family eating together, talking to me, caring about me, as if I were the center of the meal. I said in a small voice, "Thank you, everyone." The truth is, a father doesn't ask for much. Just hearing someone ask, "Dad, what do you like?" is enough warmth to last me a whole week. My son, Jason, put his hand on my shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. "We were wrong, Dad. We just assumed you didn't need to be asked, but we forgot you need to be cared for too." I nodded, staring at the reflection of our 3 generations sitting side by side in the large plate glass window of the restaurant. Not perfect, not rich, nothing to show off to the world. Just the kind of simple, full days I had wished for my entire life. On the way home, I walked for a little while with my grandson. He held my hand and said, "Grandpa, let's do this again soon. But next time, you pick a restaurant near the ocean. I want to hear the story about you and Grandma watching the sunset together." I laughed. "All right, we will. I'll tell you everything. Starting with the story of how I met your grandmother when I was about your dad's age." He looked up at me, his eyes shining. "Then you'll stay with me forever, right, Grandpa?" I didn't answer right away. I looked up at the night sky and said slowly, "Grandpa will be here, as long as you need me. As long as my family thinks of me as someone to share a table with, to talk to listen to." That evening, I sat in my small chair by the window, just as I always did. Steam rose from the mug of tea I held in my hands. I opened my journal and wrote just a few lines. For the first time, after all these years of living together, they asked me, "Dad, what would you like to eat?" That single question was all it took for me to feel not like a silent supporter in the shadows, but like a father who is loved. I am still the same man I always was. A little forgetful at times, with a voice that sometimes needs to repeat itself to be heard. In the mornings, I'm still the first one up, brewing tea and quietly watching the light filter through the dusty window panes. Lining up the shoes by the door and neatly folding the dish towel are old habits from a lifetime of work. This is how I live, simply and peacefully. I don't make a fuss, I don't show off, and I don't ask for anyone to call my name. But one thing has changed. Now, I am no longer the invisible presence who was once treated as if the only proper thing for an old man to do was sit still and be quiet. I am seen, and I am heard, and I am cherished as myself. I started to feel the unspoken changes, My son, who once used to cut me off mid-sentence, now waits for me to finish my thoughts. One day, he sat down beside me and asked quietly, "Dad, when you were working construction, weren't you ever scared of the heights?" I smiled. I was terrified. But I was more terrified of your mother if I wasn't home on time. He laughed, and then he sighed. I'm finally starting to understand just how hard it must have been for you back then. A single comment like that is enough to keep me warm for a week. My daughter-in-law, who used to glare at me if I ever offered a thought on how to raise my grandson, now comes to me for advice. Not out of polite formality, but because she truly wants to hear my opinion. One afternoon, she sat down at the table while I was tending to my bonsai tree and asked in a low voice, "Dad, Leo has been startling awake a lot lately. Do you think maybe I'm being too harsh with him?" I put down my trimming shears, looked at her, and nodded. It's possible. A child is like a young tree. If it's always being hit by strong winds, it will grow crooked. She was quiet for a moment, then she smiled. Thank you. I'll try to watch my tone tomorrow. I didn't say anything more, just went back to trimming a branch that was leaning toward the sun. My heart felt like the early morning light, just warm enough for new hope to begin to sprout. My grandson is 4 years old. There was once a time when he was left at daycare without his favorite towel, because I hadn't been there to pick him up, but now, he and his grandpa are inseparable. He doesn't ask for toys or trips to the supermarket. He's happy just to sit next to me in the afternoon, listening to me tell the old fairy tales. Grandpa, tell me the story of the weeping willow again. Grandpa, tell me the part about the fish that turned into a dragon. Grandpa, tell me the one about the princess who ran away from her mean stepmother. I smiled and asked him, "Don't you ever get tired of these? You still like hearing the same stories over and over?" He just shook his head. "It's not boring at all, Grandpa. Every time you tell a story, I feel like I'm right there, inside of it." I looked at that innocent, upturned face, and I felt my chest grow tight. Sometimes, you don't need grand, elaborate apologies. Sometimes, all you need is a child, honest and pure, who loves you for who you are. That alone is enough to heal the wounds that adults leave on each other without even realizing it. I am no longer asking for anything more. I am not holding on to old grievances. I don't expect anyone to change themselves for my sake. All I want is for someone each day to listen. Dad, is your back tired today? Grandpa, let's go to the farmer's market together tomorrow. Dad, how's this stew? I think I might have made it a little bland. That's all. That is more than enough. Because, to exist inside someone else's question, that is the most certain proof that you are still truly, properly alive. I remember one time, during dinner, my grandson suddenly spoke up out of the blue. "If Grandpa was gone," he said, his voice serious, "the house would be really lonely. Wouldn't it?" The table fell silent. No one knew what to say next. I didn't say anything either. I just carefully picked a piece of fish from my plate, placed it onto his, and gave a slow nod. "Yes," I said, "it would be very lonely indeed." And then, everyone started to laugh. It was a light sound, but it felt incredibly deep, echoing with a truth we had all finally come to understand. I know full well that I don't have much time left. I'm getting older. My eyes are getting blurry, and my memory isn't as sharp as it used to be. But I'm not worried. I no longer have to carry the weight of questions that have no answers. I no longer have to endure things in silence, living like someone's shadow. Now I am not a guest who is simply staying in my son's house. I am the father and the grandfather who helps keep the rhythm of this home alive. I live quietly, but I am not forgotten. Every night, I write in my journal. Today, my son started talking about your grandmother's favorite flowers. After our conversation, he actually went out and put a fresh bouquet of them in a vase, right next to her picture on the mantelpiece. Today, my daughter-in-law let me watch Leo for the entire day. After she got home, she sent me a message of thanks, and for some reason, my heart felt strangely light. Today, I sat by myself at the window. No one called for me, but a fresh pot of tea was already brewed and waiting for me on the counter. When I came downstairs this morning, I used to think that the rest of my life would just be a series of forced smiles. But I've learned that sometimes, in just a single moment, with a perfectly timed and fitting absence, a person can awaken the people around them. And when they finally wake up, if there is still enough love left in their hearts, they will embrace this old father who has quietly watched over their home, holding his weathered hands and understanding his silent heart. My story ends here. It is not a special story. There is no great tragedy, no tearful conclusion. There are only the small, quiet changes of everyday life. But that was more than enough to warm a heart that had long felt it was forgotten. I am not a perfect father. I never wanted to be praised. All I ever wished for was that someone would listen when I offered advice, that someone would show concern when my back ached, that someone would notice when I fell silent. I chose to remain silent as one form of resistance. But at the same time, in that silence, I was finally, truly seen. Not with eyes of pity, but with eyes of understanding. My son has changed. My daughter-in-law has learned to listen. And my grandson, he became the bridge. The one who made me believe that even after days of feeling abandoned, there is still hope for a return. I do not ask for much now. A single chair by the window, a single voice calling out, "Grandpa?" A single question, "Dad, are you tired today?" That is all I need. I truly believe this. If I have those small things, then I will have lived a life that was full enough. To all of you who have listened to my story, thank you. This has been the story of a quiet old father, a man who isn't very good with words, but who has supported this family with his silent efforts. I am grateful to you for staying with me until the end. I hope my humble story might be a small reason for you to listen more closely to the voices of the important people around you. I'll see you all again in the next video. Until then, please live in love. And I pray that no one in your home ever has to fall silent for too long.